Hi, this is Steve Nash on a sunny day leading up to the summer solstice weekend. Always plenty to talk about in automotive, isn't there? But today, in particular, my attention was drawn to the latest unemployment figures, both generally but also as they apply to automotive. So let's get into it a little bit. So the latest youth unemployment figures, January to March 26, the rate of unemployment of economically active young people. So that's an important distinction to make. So before anybody says, oh, these people, they don't want to work. No, these are people who are ready, willing and able to work, but can't find jobs at the moment. That's running at 16.2%. which is 3 times the general unemployment rate, which is 5%. Now to put that into context, that's 729,000 16 to 24-year-olds. Let that sink in, because that's not far off the total number of people who work in automotive. Now that's a sobering thought, isn't it? And then a term you hear bandied around a lot is NEETs. Those people who are not in employment, education or training, which sits at 13.5% or just over 1 million people. We know why, don't we? We know why. I mean, NI, minimum wage, so the cost of employment has risen. And of course, we have a challenging economic situation. So, there are good reasons why those numbers exist. But if you look at automotive in particular, there's a lady at the Institute of the Motor Industry called Emma Carrigy. She heads up the IMI's research team. It's a great lady, actually. I've got a lot of time for Emma. And during my time at the IMI, Emma became Office of National Statistics qualified. Now, the Office of National Statistics don't let just anybody have access to numbers or to play around with them or quote them, because for obvious reasons they don't want things being misquoted. They need to know that whoever's got access to those numbers can analyse them properly and interpret them properly and use them responsibly. And Emma had to submit herself to an exam, a qualification of sorts, to be able to have access to that data. And I have to say that it's not straightforward when you look at automotive, because the employment numbers are sort of hidden within occupation codes, SOC codes they're called. I can't for the life of me remember what the S stands for, but occupational codes, of which there are a great many. And there are few, if any, that are specifically related to automotive. So you have to really know your stuff to be able to get into the different occupational codes and analyse which elements of those are automotive and which aren't, because there are some that go across sort of general engineering and other occupations. But Emma's brilliant at it, and I really do commend her regular employment reports to you, because the data in there is well sorted and extremely interesting and important for us to understand. Now, since the pandemic, we've been talking a lot about vacancy figures in automotive, and just after the pandemic, it stood at about 24,000, big number across our sector, and a big contributor to those numbers was technicians. I mean, perennially for as long as I can remember, and I've been in this industry longer than I would care to admit. But I've often said, and I used to say this to the team at the IMI quite regularly, maybe the day that somebody turns around and says to me, yeah, we don't have a problem with technicians, got loads of them, is the day I can sort of step away. But that hasn't happened yet, and don't see it happening in the immediate future either. But the latest report that Emma's put together show the figure sitting for vacancies in automotive sitting at around about 13,000. Now that sounds like good news, doesn't it? But unfortunately, when you look at the reasons behind that, it isn't all good news. I mean, a very significant part of that is that a lot of those vacancies have just disappeared because people have said, in the current circumstances, I just don't want to employ somebody into that role. And that's not good because in many cases, the roles that are disappearing are those entry-level roles, the ones that bring in the lifeblood of the industry for future generations. And, that's extremely worrying. Specifically, apprenticeship numbers. While I was at the IMI, I represented Automotive on the Skills Federation, which is run by a lady called Dame Julie Meller. Up to that point, Automotive hadn't had a specific representation, which is crazy given that we are a cornerstone of the economy. But coming out of the pandemic, the three worst affected sectors, we were the third worst. Building and hospitality were the worst affected. And, a lot of that was post-Brexit, when we saw an exodus of Eastern Europeans from our economy. Once the pound virtually reached parity with the euro, it no longer made economic sense for them to be working here and sending money home when they could be earning similar money where they came from. So we saw we definitely know that affected our industry, and those of you out there listening will have your own stories around that. And it's been well publicised. It had a pretty catastrophic effect in those other two sectors. But coming back to apprenticeships, back when I first left BMW to take up the role of CEO of the IMI, actually I hadn't officially taken over yet. I took over on January the 1st, 2013. But in November of 2012, I was asked if I would go along as the sort of incoming CEO, along with my then chairman, to a meeting at the government offices in Vauxhall, where we would hear from the sort of Undersecretary of State, junior minister, if you like, who was going to tell us all about the proposed reforms to apprenticeships. Now, if you go back to the coalition government headed by David Cameron, the highest ever number of new apprenticeship starts were achieved. Over 2 million apprenticeship starts were achieved. And when the coalition gave way to a full Tory administration under David Cameron, they set out an ambition to achieve 3 million apprentice starts. Yeah, lofty ambition. We've never come close to it. We've not actually ever achieved 2 million since, or even close to, actually. Some of that was due to the apprenticeship reforms that were introduced by a youngish politician at the time. You might have heard of a chap called Matthew Hancock. Yeah. My initial impressions of him, I remember myself and my chairman leaving that meeting and both looking at each other quizzically and saying, what was that all about? This guy was meant to be listening to the views of employers and taking them on board. He was singularly unwilling to do that. He just wanted us to all tell him that everything he was doing was great so that he could offer it up as a success and get his next job. And we all know how that worked out for him, don't we? But let's move on. So post the introduction of the reforms, we saw a reduction in apprenticeship numbers, largely because employers were confused. They didn't totally understand the levy. And of course, a lot of the administration that went on around apprenticeships was formerly able to be handled by the training organisation, whoever that was, whether that was the Manufacturers Academy or an external training organisation. And that all got passed over to the employer. And that didn't land well initially. And even the big employers, and I used to attend meetings of some, regular meetings with some of the biggest employers in the sector. It would just, as I said, just didn't land well. And it meant that the numbers went backwards. Pre the reforms, we were regularly seeing north of 12,000 apprenticeship starts a year. That dropped back to about 10,000. But, once we got people used to the reforms, it sort of levelled at around the 10,000 mark. But the last really good year, if you want to put it that way, was 2018-19, pre-pandemic. That's an academic year, where the numbers were sort of just north of 10,000 new starts. It's never recovered to that level post-pandemic, for lots of reasons. The shame of it is that the automotive employers give back around 40 to 50% of unused levy every year. It gets clawed back, by the Treasury, who use it for anything but, employment. It just goes into the general coffers and gets spent on all of the other things they need to spend money on, welfare, and that where it will be, but it doesn't get redirected to where it came from or where it should be used. So in the last 5 years, our sector, our employers have given back about £4.4 billion to the Treasury, which is shocking, really. The National Franchise Dealer Association believe that only around 4% of employers use all of their levy funds. And I'm slightly surprised it's even at that level, to be honest with you. The shame of it is that, in all of my career at BMW, pretty much all of it, I was there for sort of 26 years. And for at least 23, 24 years, I had some form of training reporting to me. Technical training initially, but for at least 15 years I had the whole academy reporting to me, and I was always aware that whatever it was that we asked the dealers to do in the way of training, and that was a lot, it's 50,000 plus training days a year undertaken by the dealers, and whatever any other manufacturer was asking for. The big employers particularly spent a significant amount of money outside of that, which was their way of kind of looking, I guess, for sort of competitive advantage versus other employers in the sector. And I was always banging on to those that I knew, and I knew a lot of them, a lot of the HR directors and so on, that I would look, they would show me their, whatever it was, their latest sales training program, for new trainees and so on, graduate trainees or whatever they may be, coming into the sector. And I was always saying to them, this could be an apprenticeship with very little effort and a bit of help from maybe some people at the IMI or whatever. This could be an apprenticeship. You could be using levy funds. So at the moment, you're spending money over here on a scheme, and you're giving back money over here that you don't use, which is clawed back levy. That's a double whammy. You could bring those two things together. You could be using levy money, and as the old saying goes, jobs are good. But that's happened on a very, very low level, and it's still an opportunity, and it still needs sorting. Now, there's long been talk about some reform with the levy, enabling employers to use the levy in different ways. And now I got to admit, hands up, I was not initially in favour of that, because as the term says, as it says on the tin, it's an apprenticeship levy. And I was very much concerned that if people were able to spend it on all sorts of other things, we'd actually see a reduction in what it was meant to be spent on. But we're seeing that anyway. So now, all bets are off, really, aren't they? I think we need to find more flexible ways of using it, and other ways of perhaps bringing in young people, particularly, to help us build the workforce of the future, which is utterly essential. I heard on the news this morning that the hospitality sector in particular is working with the government to get certain concessions and help around this that will enable them that will mitigate some of the minimum sort of costs of employment and help them bring in more young people. Well, we need the same. We need the same. That's something definitely that my former colleagues at the IMI and the other major bodies like the RMI or NFDA, IGA, SMMT, those big, influential bodies in the industry, IAAF, need to be representing, because this is all happening at a time when we're going through unprecedented change, been said many times, and at a time when we need newly skilled young people who can come in and bring their skills to help us adapt through that change, this fourth industrial revolution, electrification, automation, and everything else, AI. This is not the time not to be bringing in young skilled people, digital natives. But I understand why it's happening, and we need to do something about that. Okay, sermon over really, but I just want to refer you to Steve Nash FutureProof is a podcast series that I'm launching, and the first of those episodes, we did a sort of taster recently with my interview with Sean Green, the CEO of BMW China, or he was at that point in time, which I hope those of you who've watched it have found interesting. The first of my kind of studio-based interviews is with a young lady called Megan Andrews, and Megan is a second-year engineering undergraduate who's absolutely passionate about automotive. She ran her school's F24 program, which is where students are encouraged to build and run a car competitively. I don't think they actually race as such. I think it was an electric base car, and they had, it's about which ones can go the furthest and so on. But it's a great introduction to automotive engineering and race engineering even. But she continued to support that program after leaving school. But I've remained in touch with her since the interview, which was done a little while ago, and I know she's looking outside of the sector, partially because of lack of opportunities and lack of response, actually, from potential automotive employers, which is rather sad. I will do my best with people that I know to try and make the right connections for her, but it's a perennial subject, isn't it? Not just about bringing more young people in, but about bringing more young females into the sector. Now, I know there are lots of people doing heavy duty work on that, Automotive 30% Club, of course, and others, but it's still a challenge. Throughout many years of my career, we've been trying to get more young females into apprenticeships, for example, and other roles that have normally been male dominated. The interesting thing is those that we did bring in were always outstanding, but it never seemed to open the floodgates. There are things that we can do, and that's probably a subject for another day. But I hope you've found the discussion interesting. But let me know. Give me your feedback. Tell me where you think I am talking sense, or maybe where I've missed something. But also tell me what else you'd like me to talk about. As I said, there's never a shortage of news and things to talk about in our sector, but I want to be talking about what you want me to be talking about. So listen, have a great day and a lovely summer solstice weekend. It's going to be a hot one. So look forward to seeing you soon.